J.R.R. Tolkien hated Disney. He said that Disney had talent, but that it was hopelessly corrupted. He said his stories were disgusting and even nausea-inducing. And there's this viral thread going around right now on X by the Culturist that kind of is telling this story and shedding some light on it. So I thought I'd share it here and also share some of my own thoughts about this. The Hobbit was published a few months before the Snow White movie came out in 1937. Tolkien watched it with his friend C.S. Lewis and later insisted that Disney never adapt his own works. Tolkien dedicated his life to the study and creation of myths, which he called fairy stories. For him, age-old tales like Beowulf weren't just entertainment, but vehicles of profound truth emerged from cultural soil over generations. Disney took folkloric material and stripped it of its spiritual depth, commercializing what Tolkien deemed essentially sacrosanct. But how, exactly? Take Snow White. In the Brothers Grimm original, published in 1812, Snow White flees into the forest, bargains, and works to earn her shelter. In Disney's version, she simply sings to animals and waits to be rescued. Throughout, danger, violence, and ambiguity were erased, replaced by a tale designed to comfort children, not to warn them. Instead of Grimm's brutal justice delivered to the queen, forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies, the story ends with a kiss. Tolkien loathed sugar-coated storytelling like this, and he kept the rough edges in his own works. The Hobbit was written for his children, but it contained anger, hardship, horror, evil, and death. As G.K. Chesterton once said, fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. The children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. Disneyfication also deprives stories of spiritual weight. Grimm's original lost its deeper symbols of renewal, death, and resurrection, and Disney's bumbling dwarfs lacked the depth of Norse tradition, craftsmen of the mountains with deep spiritual ties to the land. Why were fairy stories and myths so sacred to Tolkien? Because he knew that myths are not lies, but the precise opposite. Myths convey the essential truths, the primary reality of life itself. He saw the great man-made myths throughout history as fragments of divine truth. We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Similarities among ancient myths arose because they were all pointing to the same truth, thought Tolkien. Then one myth really came true at a tangible moment in history, the true myth that we are all living inside. So, more than mere fiction, Tolkien's myths were designed to be lived at a deeper level of imagination. He saw fantasy world building as a kind of sub-creation, mirroring God's creation, not something to be cheapened or commercialized. In 1937, Disney began sanitizing fairy stories for children. Now they sanitize them for adults, contorting folkloric stories to fit modern politics. All right, super interesting, right? So that's kind of a great outline of the differences between Disney and Tolkien in their artistic philosophy. But from the horse's mouth, here's what Tolkien had to say about Disney specifically. I recognize Disney's talent, but it has always seemed to me hopelessly corrupted. Though in most of the pictures proceeding from his studios, there are admirable or even charming passages, the effect of all of them to me is disgusting. Some have given me nausea. All right, so not exactly mincing words there. Then when he was told by a publisher that they were interested in having American illustrators for The Hobbit, he responded, "As long as it were possible, I should like to add to veto anything from or influenced by the Disney studios, for all of whose works I have had a heartfelt loathing." Then in his famous essay called On Fairy Stories, in which he lays out his own philosophy on storytelling and myth-making, he says this: "It is true that in recent times fairy stories have usually been written or adapted for children. Fairy stories banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would in the end be ruined. Indeed, insofar as they have been so banished, they have been ruined." Now, a great example of a contrast between Tolkien's approach and Disney's is just by looking at their use of dwarves in their respective 1937 works, Snow White and The Hobbit. So Disney took dwarves from the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, in which they're portrayed as kind of this dark, folklorish, and really just practical mythological creatures. Disney instead kind of dumbed them down. He made them very humorous, lighthearted, gave them names like Dopey, Sleepy, and Grumpy, kind of transformed them into a more Americanized, more emotionally compelling, and entertainment-oriented characters. Tolkien, on the other hand, drew his inspiration for dwarves from the 13th century writings of Snorri Sturluson. Tolkien was a medievalist. He studied ancient literature, especially ancient mythologies, especially of the Icelandic, Scandinavian, Northern European countries. And in those writings, you actually find the names of the dwarves that he used in The Hobbit. Names like Owen and Glóin and Balin and Dwalin and Bithyr and Bolfer. Those are actual names that appear in different forms in the writings of 13th century poet Snorri Sturluson. Tolkien also situates them in this deep and rich epic mythology where they had this lost kingdom that they're trying to gain back after a dragon had ruined it and stolen it from them. He invented an entire language spoken by the dwarves. So Tolkien obviously takes them much more seriously, and he uses his imagination and expertise to construct a grander narrative and a deeper, far-reaching sort of world that these dwarves kind of live in, and it's informed by his studies of ancient languages and ancient mythologies. Meanwhile, Disney is just basically taking a prepackaged fairy tale, stripping out the parts he doesn't like, and repackaging it as something that he can use as mass market appeal. But it's not just that Tolkien was interested in an epic and kind of adult-oriented adaptation of these ancient stories into modern art. Tolkien really lamented the fact that there was so little left of the ancient stories of Northern Europe as compared to, say, the Greeks and the Romans, where we know all about Ulysses and Hercules and all the ancient gods and stories, and even the language was very much better known going back thousands of years of ancient Greek or Latin compared to what was known of Old Norse or Old English or Gothic or Gaelic or Celtic or any of these other ancient languages that Tolkien spent so much time studying. So for Tolkien, studying these ancient myths of Northern Europe and studying these ancient Northern European languages was his way of doing kind of cultural archaeology, where he was reconstructing what was a lost history and lost mythology of his own culture. So for example, he was fascinated with the idea of elves because in Anglo-Saxon, the word elf is alf, and that is a word that has connotations of nobility, of purity, of strength, of poise, of grace, of beauty, and he was frustrated with the way that elves were understood to be small, little devious creatures like Keebler elves or something like that. Even the name Gandalf, Gond is an adaptation of an Anglo-Saxon word for wand or magic, and elf or elf. So you have a magic elf, and that's kind of where the inspiration for him being a wizard comes from. So you see Tolkien is kind of using his expertise in these ancient languages and his studies of these mythologies to sort of reconstruct a grand narrative. But I think the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room at this point becomes, well, what about the fact that Tolkien kind of weaved in Christian ideas, narratives, and themes into The Hobbit, into Lord of the Rings? Isn't that adapting the source material for his own purposes in the same way that Disney did? So is he really that much better? A lot of critics have pointed that out. And yeah, to be fair, if the goal is merely to faithfully adapt source material, then maybe Tolkien does fail on that account. But I think Tolkien would argue, and spoiler alert, I'd probably agree with him, is that while Disney kind of took these stories like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales and sort of dumbed them down, made them for mass market appeal, gave them more emotional resonance, sanitized them of their scarier elements or moral depth, Tolkien actually adds depth to what little was known of these ancient mythologies by infusing the Christian story into it, because the Christian story is, in Tolkien's view and in mine, a actual historical story, and it is the historical story, the deepest that there is, and it is the deepest mythology that is. So by infusing these ancient stories with the actual Christian story underneath it, not in a hokey propagandistic way where it's very like on the nose, much more like C.S. Lewis did in the Chronicles of Narnia, where you have a figure like Aslan, who's very clearly an allegorical type of Jesus Christ. Instead, Tolkien just lets the values of Christianity infuse the world and the moral complexity of his characters and the good versus evil that's happening. He doesn't make this very simplistic, sanitized world. The characters have flaws, the good ones, they're corrupted or corruptible or redemptive or redeemable, and it's a much more faithful adaptation of reality, of something that resonates in our hearts as something that rings true, that seems real to us and true to life and true to our experience. And to me, it's that depth that Tolkien infused into his storytelling that unlocks something that resonated with people on a much more primal, a much more human, a much more existential level. What's so fascinating is like Tolkien already hated the 1937 version of Snow White because it was morally sanitized and simplistic. It didn't treat the source material with enough reverence, etc. But nowadays we look back at the 1937 version with nostalgia. We hated this new version, but we look at that one because it has what seems to us now to be timeless values. It seems to really capture capture some themes of femininity and youthful innocence and death and rebirth and all this stuff that seems to have at least some depth to it, which compared to the 2025 version that just came out, which seems to be this feminist girl boss, communist, not going to be saved by the prince, going to liberate her society from the oppression and have everyone share everything equally. And that's what being fairest of them all means. It's like, what happened here? So it's really funny to see that as Disney has kind of evolved, and even as it's acquired other properties, other famous stories and cultural mythology of modern times like Star Wars and Marvel, it's continued to adapt those for entertainment purposes. And in so doing, it has stripped them of what value, what moral complexity, what depth that they actually had, which as far as I'm concerned, the further they go in that direction, the better Lord of the Rings looks by comparison. Rings of Power notwithstanding. Those are pretty much my thoughts, guys. I just thought it was really fascinating that this thread was getting so much traction right now, even 80, 90 years later after the Snow White and the Hobbit came out, and people are interested in this contrast, and we see Disney kind of dying and we see Tolkien kind of being proven right in my estimation as time goes on, because he did tap into something that is ultimately the deepest and the truest thing that is. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and thanks for watching.